Unresolved conflict. Now this one is a little trickier and a little more difficult to acknowledge. One happily married lady was suffering from anxiety and depression. It was difficult to tell which was the worse, the depression or the anxiety. I asked her what changes occurred within 6 months preceding her depression and anxiety, and she said her dad came to live with her. I asked her how she felt about her dad, and she told me that she blamed her dad for her mother's passing, that he was a terrible father and husband. In her words, he was a bastard. This confused me, as I was wondering why she took in her dad after all the bad feelings she had for him. So I asked, "How do you feel about your dad today?" Her answer was, "You're supposed to love your dad, aren't you?" Turns out this lady had a conflict, an unresolved conflict. Part of her hated her dad, and the other part, maybe it was left over from a Sunday school lesson, was supposed to love her dad. She had to look at her belief, "You're supposed to love your parents," and realize that this belief was limiting her, holding her down. Truth was, she still hated her dad and didn't know what to do about it. And the belief, "You're supposed to love your parents," kept her from doing anything. Ultimately, she resolved her conflict in finding senior housing for him to live, and her depression lifted as she got beyond the guilt. Now, it doesn't have to be this dramatic. One fellow, married for about 15 years, loved his wife, but hated some of her behaviors. But he could not allow himself to feel hatred, thinking it would detract from the love he felt. For him, it was also important to resolve the love-hate conflict. He learned to tell his wife that he loves her and hates some of her behaviors. Well, actually, he learned to say it this way: "I love you and have a big problem with some of your behaviors." Something he could never bring himself to say before. He can't say the word hate yet, but he can at least acknowledge to himself that he does hate some of her behaviors. Something he couldn't do before, and much to his surprise, his depression lifted when he was able to express himself honestly to his wife. Another woman, Joyce, who was in and out of depression many times in her life, was caught between two people. The two significant people in her life were her mother, who was ailing in health, and her fiancé. She felt torn between the two. When she was with her fiancé, she felt guilty for leaving her mother alone, and when she was with her mother, she felt guilty for not being with her fiancé. The inability to resolve this conflict led Joyce into serious depression. She couldn't say to her fiancé, "I love you and need to be with my mother, and I hope you understand." It was too difficult. It was also too difficult for her to say to her mother, "I love you and I also love my fiancé, who I also like to be with. I feel torn between the two of you." She didn't know how to deal with being torn between the two of them, so she felt like she was in this box with no openings. When she was able to be honest with both her mother and her fiancé regarding feelings torn between them, she was amazed how much time she actually had to be with both of them, and her depression lifted. What stood in the way of her telling her mother and her fiancé the truth was the fear that both of them would be hurt, knowing that she wanted to be elsewhere when she was with them. In other words, she was trying to read their minds, and when she came clean with both of them, it wasn't that way at all. Jill, being married for over a year, told me how happy she was being a married woman. And then while talking about her husband, a Freudian slip occurred, and she said that she hated her husband, and immediately corrected herself with, "No, I mean I love my husband." Further discussion revealed that she hated some of the arguments she and her husband were having, and his lack of understanding. But the reality is that she does hate him and wishes that she hadn't gotten married sometimes, even though it's been only a year since they've been married. So here we have Jill, who on one hand wants to be married, and on the other hand hates being married because of the arguments and the lack of being understood. The inability to recognize the conflict and to realize that she has two opposing feelings, love and hate, for the same person led to her depression. She oscillated between the depression and the anxiety. When she could give herself permission to have two opposing feelings for the same person, mainly her husband, without thinking she was a bad or undeserving person, her depression and anxiety disappeared. She was able to then say to her husband, "I love you, and let's agree to disagree," without jeopardizing the essence of herself. Now, I've provided you with several examples from which you can hopefully relate, and quite frankly, if your depression is the result of an unresolved conflict, you may be too close to see it clearly, which is why I suggest professional consultation in the beginning of this program. Let what you learn in this program guide your sessions. You now know you're looking for a conflict in your feelings, usually towards someone with whom you're close. You can also go back to my website and select the private consultation link in the left navigation bar, or find it in the right portion of the Stress Management Bulletin you'll be receiving on a monthly basis. Remember, with all the examples I've shared with you, we've never resisted or fought the depression. Many were able to move through the depression free of medication, and those that were taking meds, the solution was in the mental awarenesses that allowed them to become free of the meds. For other programs complementary to this one, visit www.dstressdoc.com. That's D as in day, S as in Sam, T as in Tom, R as in red, E as in easy, S as in Sam, another S as in Sam, D as in day, O as in out, and C as in cat.com. This program is copyrighted by the Stress Management Institute, 28 Tyndall Road, Middletown, New Jersey, 07748. Federal law expressly prohibits the copying or transcription of this material without written authorization from an authorized representative of the Stress Management Institute.